Taron Johnson is back. Just let that land for a second. The Las Vegas Raiders posted their practice photos today, and right there, in the middle of that field, was their starting slot corner. Present, active, and back in the building after missing everything up to this point in the offseason program. And I'm not going to pretend I'm calm about this, because I'm genuinely not. This is significant. This matters more than the headline suggests, and I want to take my time explaining exactly why. Because I think a lot of people are going to gloss over this news and move on to the flashier stuff happening around the league. Don't do that. This is the kind of thing that quietly determines whether a defense functions or falls apart when the real games begin. Let me tell you something about the slot corner position that I think gets chronically undervalued in the way people talk about NFL defenses. Everyone wants to discuss the boundary corners, the guys on the outside matching up against the #1 receivers, playing press coverage on the island, the ones whose names end up in the highlight packages. And sure, those players matter. A great outside corner changes games. But the slot corner, the guy lined up in the interior of your defense, the guy who has to deal with everything that comes across the middle of the field, that position is where defenses get broken. That is where offenses find their rhythm. That is where the quick game lives, where crossing routes and option routes and pick concepts get designed to create chaos. If you don't have a reliable, talented player in that slot, opposing offensive coordinators will identify it within the first quarter of Game 1, and they will spend the next 16 weeks attacking it relentlessly until you fix it. And here is what makes the slot corner job so much more demanding than the outside corner role, in ways that don't always show up cleanly in statistics. Your outside corners, especially in a good scheme, can be somewhat protected. You can bracket a receiver. You can roll coverage over the top. You can take away one side of the field with your safety rotations. Great scheme can elevate an average outside corner into a functional one. But the slot corner cannot be scheme saved in the same way. The slot corner has to be physically talented, instinctively sound, and mentally tough enough to handle everything that comes at him. He has to be in the run fit. He has to tackle reliably in space. He has to cover at multiple levels of the field simultaneously. He has to blitz, drop into zones, play man coverage against slot receivers, who are specifically designed by offensive architects to be mismatches. There is no hiding a bad slot corner. You either have someone capable there or you have a problem. And before today, the Raiders were looking at a potential problem. Because what the Raiders were working with in that slot without Taron Johnson was Traden Stokes and Jeremy Chinn. And I want to be fair to both of those players because they are legitimate NFL talents. But neither of them is a natural slot corner in the traditional sense. Jeremy Chinn is at his best as a box safety, a physical downhill player who affects the run game and plays near the line of scrimmage. Asking him to mirror a shifty slot receiver through a full route tree across 4 quarters of professional football is asking him to do something that is genuinely outside his optimal role. Stokes, the second-round pick out of Arizona, played what they called the FCAP position in college, essentially a 3-safety system where he operated in a hybrid role. It's a fascinating college concept. It does not translate to the NFL. No team in this league runs a defense that maps cleanly onto what that role asked of him in college. Calling that slot corner experience at the professional level is a stretch, and anyone telling you otherwise is working with a very loose definition of the position. So when those practice photos dropped today, and Taron Johnson was standing out there on that field with his teammates, I felt genuine relief. Not the polite, measured kind where you acknowledge good news and move on. Real relief, because the alternative, going into mandatory minicamp, then training camp, then the regular season with Stokes and Chinn competing for a position neither is ideally built to play at a high level, was a scenario that had legitimate risk attached to it. The slot is too important. The position is too demanding. You cannot patch it together and hope for the best against the offenses in this league. Now, the timing here matters enormously for what Taron Johnson is actually going to be able to absorb before the lights come on. He has missed every practice leading up to this point, while his teammates were going through the early installs of the defensive system under Robbie Leonard, while the communication was being built between players, while the terminology was becoming second nature, and the concepts were being layered in progressively. Johnson was absent. That is not nothing. Defensive installation is a cumulative process. Every day builds on the previous one. The guys who were there from the beginning have a head start that cannot be fully replicated simply by showing up now and working harder. But here is the thing. The Raiders go into mandatory minicamp on June 9th. That is the inflection point where everything becomes required and where the formal evaluation clock really starts ticking. Between now and June 11th, there are essentially 7 more practices before the entire program pauses and everyone goes home until training camp begins in late July. That is roughly 6 or 7 weeks away. Those practices between now and the break are Johnson's window to get his feet under him, to start absorbing the scheme, to build the communication with the safeties and linebackers around him that makes a secondary function as a connected unit rather than 5 individuals running their own assignments. It is a compressed timeline, but it is workable for a player of his caliber and experience level. One thing I also want to address is the contract situation hanging over all of this, because it has been part of the conversation around why Johnson was absent in the first place. He reportedly wanted a reworked deal, wanted the guaranteed money to reflect what he brings to this defense, and these voluntary OTA absences are often how veterans apply pressure on that front without triggering fines or mandatory attendance violations. It is a calculated approach, and I think there is a reasonable chance that whatever needed to be resolved between Johnson and the Raiders organization has been addressed or at least progressed significantly, given that he walked back through those doors today. We may see a formal contract announcement over the next few days. We may not, but his presence on that practice field tells you something about where those conversations stand. Now I want to shift to what has been happening around the broader league, because there have been some genuinely significant moves going down that demand honest analysis, and the Raiders factor into at least part of this conversation, whether directly or by implication. Let me start with the one that has people talking the most, because it is legitimately one of the more surprising transactions I have watched unfold in recent memory. Myles Garrett is no longer a Cleveland Brown. That sentence still sounds strange to me. Garrett, who has been the face of that defense for years, who has been one of the most dominant pass rushers in professional football, who has been the single most identifiable player on that entire roster for half a decade, is now a Los Angeles Ram. And what Los Angeles gave up to make that happen tells you everything about how serious Sean McVay is about winning a championship right now. The Rams surrendered Jared Verse, a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and a third-round pick to bring Garrett to Los Angeles. That is an enormous package. Some people have pushed back on the price tag given that Garrett is 30 years old, and I understand that instinct. You are giving up youth and future flexibility for a player on the back half of his career timeline. But I think those concerns, while not entirely unreasonable, miss the larger strategic picture that the Rams are operating within. They lost to the Seahawks last season because their defense could not get stops when they needed them most. That failure was decisive. It ended their season. McVay watched it happen and decided the response was not to be patient and rebuild. The response was to go get one of the 3 best pass rushers on the planet and pair him with the other pieces already on that defense. And when you think about defensive ends and how long the elite ones actually play in this league, the age concern softens considerably. Julius Peppers played at a high level until he was 38. Dwight Freeney played until his late 30s. The best defensive ends in NFL history have consistently demonstrated that the position ages better than almost any other on the field because pass rush is built on technique and leverage and hand fighting as much as pure athleticism. And those skills do not evaporate at 30 the way speed does for a skill position player. Myles Garrett could easily play another 5, 6, 7 productive seasons if he stays healthy and motivated. He is not a rental, he is not a bridge solution, he is a cornerstone, which connects directly to the other major piece of the Rams picture that I think people are significantly underreacting to, Ty Simpson. The Rams used a draft pick on a quarterback. On the surface, that looks like a confusing organizational signal. Why draft a quarterback when you just went all in to win right now? Why not use every available resource on the defensive pieces and skill position players that could push Matthew Stafford and this roster over the championship line immediately? I want to be unambiguous about something here. Sean McVay did not let that happen against his will. McVay has walked away from the Rams before when the organizational direction was moving somewhere he did not want to go. The idea that a quarterback was drafted for this roster without his full endorsement and genuine belief in that player is simply not credible. McVay signed off on Ty Simpson. That means McVay sees something in Simpson that he believes in enough to plan around. And I think within 2 to 3 seasons, Simpson will be the starting quarterback in Los Angeles, by which point Myles Garrett will still be playing at a high level and will be the veteran anchor of a defense built around a young franchise quarterback. That is not a contradiction. That is long-term organizational architecture being built under the cover of a win-now move. For the Browns, this trade makes real sense when you zoom out from the emotional weight of losing Garrett. They get Jared Verse back. a 25-year-old pass rusher who I think belongs in the top 20 at his position in this league already. They get a first-round pick in 2027, which matters enormously because that draft class has the makings of one of the better talent pools we have seen in 15 years. I am genuinely convinced the 2027 draft is going to be exceptional, and a first-round selection in that class is an asset with real long-term value. Add a second and third-round pick on top of that, and Cleveland, a franchise that has sometimes struggled to maximize its draft capital, has a legitimate foundation to build something durable. Verse is the key piece for me. A young, powerful, technique-first defensive end who can anchor a pass rush for the next decade is exactly the kind of building block a team trying to establish a new identity should want. Now let me address the A.J. Brown situation, because this one has me genuinely unsettled about the Patriots' decision-making. Brown was traded from Philadelphia to New England for a first-round pick and a fifth-round pick, which is a better package than 2/5, but is still, in my honest assessment, not enough value for what the Patriots are actually acquiring in terms of risk and trajectory. I want to be measured here because A.J. Brown is a phenomenal football player when healthy and engaged. His talent is not in question, but Brown is 28 years old, and the Patriots are not a team currently positioned on a 2-year championship window. They are rebuilding. Their timeline to genuine competitiveness is probably 3 to 4 years at the earliest, which means by the time New England is actually competing for something meaningful, A.J. Brown will be 31 or 32, and on the declining side of what made him one of the best receivers in football. That mismatch between player age and organizational timeline is the fundamental problem with this trade for New England, and I think it is going to become more apparent as the years pass. You want your most expensive, most committed to skill position acquisitions to align with your competitive window. Brown peaks now and for the next 2 years. The Patriots' window does not align with that. This is paying peak price for a player whose best football may not overlap with your best football, and that is a gamble with significant downside. Which brings me back to the Raiders, because some people have been making noise on social media suggesting that Las Vegas was too passive, too conservative, too unwilling to push their chips in on trades like these. And I want to address that directly because I think the criticism fundamentally misunderstands where the Raiders are in their organizational timeline. The Raiders' core for the next 5 to 7 years is built around Brock Bowers, Ashton Jeanty, and Fernando Mendoza. Those 3 players represent the foundation of what this franchise is constructing. That is the timeline. That is the window. And when you are building toward a competitive peak that is 2 to 3 years away, you do not compromise your future draft capital for a 28-year-old receiver who will be 31 when you finally arrive at that window, or for a pass rusher acquisition that would cost you 3 or 4 first-round picks without a quality player to offer in return. The math simply does not work in the Raiders' favor on either of those transactions. What I actually want from the Raiders is patience and precision. Get the right players in the right moments when the timing aligns with the organizational trajectory. Jack Bash is a second-round pick with real upside at receiver. A.J. Brown himself was a second-round pick. You do not always have to go spend maximum resources to find the player who changes your offense. Sometimes the right pick at the right time does exactly that. The Raiders are not a team that can afford to mortgage 2027 and 2028 draft capital right now. Not when those draft classes look the way they look, and not when the team is still in the construction phase of something that could genuinely be special. Then there is Odell Beckham Jr., who apparently has not exhausted his attempts to remain in the NFL, signing with the New York Giants alongside Juju Smith-Schuster. I appreciate the nostalgia element of OBJ returning to New York. I understand why it generates attention. But I would be genuinely surprised if either of those players finishes the season on that 53-man roster, given where the Giants are in their own rebuild and what those roster spots could mean for younger developmental players. We will see how that situation unfolds. The cap mechanics operating underneath all of this movement are worth understanding, particularly given that all of this is happening right around June 1st, which functions as a meaningful reset date in terms of how teams can structure and distribute contract obligations across future years. Post-June 1st designations allow teams to split dead cap money into 2 separate years rather than absorbing it all at once, which is why so many significant transactions cluster around this date every single offseason. The Garrett trade almost certainly involved those mechanics being applied thoughtfully on Cleveland's end to manage how his remaining contract obligations get distributed going forward. It is the kind of structural detail that does not make headlines, but that front offices think about carefully when putting these deals together. Coming back to where all of this started, Taron Johnson is back on the practice field for the Las Vegas Raiders. In a news cycle that has been dominated by blockbuster trades and big-name signings, that fact might feel like a quiet footnote. It is not. A defense without its starting slot corner is a defense with a genuine vulnerability at one of the most exploited positions in modern professional football. That vulnerability is now addressed. The Raiders go into mandatory minicamp with their expected starter back in the building, absorbing the system, building chemistry with the players around him, getting the reps that will matter when September arrives. The timeline is compressed, but it is workable. And for a team that is carefully, deliberately constructing something with real long-term potential, having your slot corner present and engaged at this stage of the process is exactly the kind of foundational stability that does not show up on a highlight reel, but absolutely shows up in the standings.